Welcome back. My guest today is Chuck Tate, the house manager and event supervisor at the Carson Forward Performing Arts Center. Today he is dressed in the uniform of a U.S. Navy lieutenant of the Second World War. He is fascinated and has done a lot of research on the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise, and he recently invited some veterans of the Enterprise to the center for a special program. He's going to tell us about that. Welcome to the show, Lieutenant.
Well, thank you, Barry. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here.
Before the show began, we were talking, and that unfortunately, a lot of young people, if you said USS Enterprise, would think, aha, that's Captain Kirk and Spock and the Starship.
Right, right.
And so I guess maybe part of your program was to make people aware of this very famous ship.
That's exactly right. To educate people my age and younger on the USS Enterprise, the United States Navy, and World War II and the Pacific War. A lot of people aren't really familiar with that theater. We've been very fortunate to have shows like Band of Brothers and
Saving Private Ryan.
And Hollywood's definitely in the last 10 years have caught on and made. Now Letters from Iwo Jima and other movies
and The Wind Talker,
right,
which was Saipan.
Right.
But you're right. It's in fact when we're doing the big 50th anniversary celebration of D-Day, I did read an article from the New York Times that said, "Don't forget Saipan." It was going on at that very moment.
Yeah.
My dad was there, but it was right. It was overshadowed by that.
And when you really start to do reading and a little research on it, it's amazing because obviously D-Day didn't take place till '44, and that's what a lot of people think about. But there were major actions in the Pacific War, and obviously 41, 42, 43. So a lot of stuff going on, even leading up to that, and D-Day in the Pacific, which would be. I guess Guadalcanal campaign,
which is way before the D-Day in Europe.
Yeah. And I didn't know the Marines defending Guadalcanal and the Henderson Field airstrip were fighting with World War II weapons or World War I weapons.
Right.
They were very outnumbered, very outgunned, all throughout the Pacific War, and they were pretty much outgunned and outnumbered.
Well, tell us a little about the veterans who came to your program.
Well, James Barnhill, a wonderful man, served on the Enterprise from 41. I believe it was, he stepped foot on the boat in September 41 and left in July of 44. He started out as the ship's bugler and an aviation photographer. And then was volunteered for aviation ordnance man, which was a bomb fuser, and rose the ranks pretty quick and became a chief in aviation ordnance and aviation photography. Received 15 battle stars. Like I said before, the Enterprise received 20 battle stars, and
is that more than any American ship in World War II?
It is. It's 3 more than any American ship and 7 more than any other carrier. At one point, it was the only carrier in the Pacific Fleet, and it was the only carrier defending Guadalcanal, the very important airstrip of Henderson Field.
Right.
And at one point, it was Enterprise versus Japan, and so 15 battle stars out of the 20, and then Bill Norberg, who was a Captain Yeoman, a Chief Captain Yeoman, which was as he says, a glorified secretary for the captain, and he served 9 captains throughout the war. He stepped foot on Enterprise early or middle of 41, and left in August of 45, I believe.
So he was on the ship
20 battle
before
stars.
we got in the war.
Right. And the interesting thing about Norberg, he dealt with so many different personalities. The commanding officers and the captains that were on and off Enterprise throughout the war. It was the flagship of the fleet. So he had some wonderful stories and just interesting men.
Share a few of those with us.
Well, Barnhill, the photographer, interesting enough, was the chief aviation photographer. So he would take photos of landings. They were, aircraft carriers were fairly new at that time, and they didn't know exactly how to use aircraft carriers. So when bombers and torpedo bombers and Wildcat fighter planes were coming in for a landing, whether it be daytime or nighttime later in the war, they would ask these photographers, if you see a plane in trouble coming to put a landing on the deck, get up in what they called the vulture's nest. Because anytime a pilot was coming in and they would see photographers taking pictures, they knew they were in trouble, because they only documented landings that were going to mess up or would destroy a plane or destroy the flight deck or would go off in the ocean. So they called it the vulture's nest, and the pilots never liked to see people taking pictures of them when they're landing.
Now, are these still pictures or moving pictures?
They're still pictures, yeah. There's a couple moving pictures, but he took mostly still photos.
Yeah.
And he rose up through the ranks and actually was an alternate photographer in Washington, D.C. under the Truman and Eisenhower administration.
Wow.
He brought some wonderful photos that have never been seen before, over 100. And one of his photos was, early in the war, was used in Life magazine when he was still just a seaman at the time.
Wow.
And
that was the ultimate photo magazine back then.
Yes, definitely. And, out of the 30,000 men that served on the Enterprise during the 9 years of her active service, 103 enlisted men and 1 officer received all 20 battle stars awarded to Enterprise and her men, and one of them was Norberg, and he was here. So,
wow,
it's just amazing when you think about the decorations, the awards, and stuff like that the Enterprise was awarded with. I mean, many of the awards made Enterprise the only ship to receive them, or receive both, or receive all of them throughout the war. So it's just unbelievable. And even more impressive when you think about the size of the ship, And
what are its dimensions? What were its dimensions?
Well, it was 809 feet long. It was 108 feet wide and 143 feet tall. And that's massive. Its flight deck was 802 feet long. It was made out of timber, one to make it a little less lighter, and but that was dangerous when it was hit by a bomb.
Oh yeah.
But it was a lot easier to repair, but it took a little more damage.
And the Enterprise was heavily damaged by suicide planes
in
the war.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that incident.
Well, later on in the war, they started using kamikazes, but earlier on in the war, the Japanese pilots were very well trained, well disciplined, and a lot more experienced than American pilots at the time. But if a torpedo bomber or dive bomber or a twin-engine Betty bomber was to take a hit from our anti-aircraft weapons, then usually they would turn back around and take the ship out, try to take the ship out. Or that happened at USS Hornet at the Battle of Santa Cruz off the Guadalcanal Islands, and it happened to Enterprise, and so they would just when the Japanese pilots were hit, they would usually turn around and try to take the ship out. Now later on in the war, it was the kamikazes that strictly was to take the ship out, fully loaded with ordnance and bombs, and that was their mission, to strictly go towards the ships as opposed to just dropping them and then bugging out. Unbelievable. It's hard to defend against a kamikaze and even a suicide bomber.
But there was a History Channel program on about the Enterprise. And in particular, they did a computer graphic of this one plane that the Americans thought they had shot this plane up, and somehow the pilot managed to pull the plane, and it crashed on the deck and caused this tremendous damage and fire. And
go ahead.
No, that's what it was. Yeah.
Well, the unsung heroes of the Pacific War, many people will tell you, are the DCOs, or the damage control units, damage control officers or damage control units. Their stations were in the bows of the ship, and they only got called up if they took a direct hit by a torpedo, by a bomb, or a suicide plane or a kamikaze, and they would have to fight to get the fire out, to get the ship repaired, to get it back online, to get it boilers burning, to get its engines running, to get its rudder repaired. I mean, all this had to take place very fast, or it was a sitting duck for other bombers or kamikazes. And many soldiers would tell you, especially on the Enterprise, that if it wasn't for those damage control units, that it would be sunk, you know, early in the war.
Going back to the vets that you had, did they talk about that? And again, the History Channel really featured this suicide attack. Did they talk about that? What were they doing in the middle of all that?
Well, these two were usually in the bows of the ship. Well, the bomb fuser was in the hangar deck, which is where they would do most of their repairs and armoring the planes. But Norberg was in the captain's bridge, which is a couple stories off the flight deck, and he was reporting all the damage to the damage control unit, letting them know exactly where the damage was, getting total counts of casualties, getting injury reports, and letting the captain know exactly how fast they thought they could get the ship back to full speed. Exactly where they were during certain hits, I'm not entirely sure. That was where they spent most of their time, though, and probably where they were when they took most of these hits.
Now, where did this take place? Where the Enterprise was damaged? Where was she when that happened?
Well, its first big damage took place off Guadalcanal when it was
early in the war.
Early in the war, it was June of 1942, and it took 3 hits from dive bombers and torpedo bombers, and it was still known as an American victory. It was there trying to defend the island, but it took some major damage, and it took out a boiler and was unable to move, and it was listing, and which means they couldn't land any planes on it. They couldn't take off any planes. They couldn't really defend itself other than with the anti-aircraft weapons that were on the ship. And it was also dangerous for the other ships in the fleet because it was out of control. The rudder was damaged. They couldn't move. But it actually saved its life. If it had been not damaged that severely and was so damaged it was taken off course, then the third round of bombers that had taken off from other Japanese carriers would have found it because they knew its coordinates. But it was so off course that it saved its life. And that's one instance where, the Lucky E comes into play. It was a big nickname that was given to the Enterprise from Pearl Harbor by, I believe it was a Time magazine writer.
Because it was one of the carriers that was absent when the Japanese attacked, and that
all of the carriers were
and that
gone.
caused the Japanese great concern because I guess they figured if we can hit them with carriers, they can hit us with carriers.
Right. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you take out carriers, you take out a lot. You take out planes, you take out their capability of bombing runs. You take out a lot more personnel. You have over close to 3,000 men on a carrier at that time.
Yeah.
And we didn't lose any. There were 7 carriers in the fleet at that time, and none of them were hurt or damaged at Pearl Harbor. Now there were a lot of others that were, unfortunately, but
pummeled.
Yeah, and so they came in. The neat thing I thought when reading about the Enterprise was it was off on a secret mission. It was coming back to Pearl Harbor, and it ran into a severe storm, and its task force was slowed because these smaller destroyers were having a heck of a time getting through these big waves in the storm, and it wasted a lot of fuel to get through them. Well, the Enterprise would have to stop 2 or 3 times to refuel these smaller vessels. That delayed the Enterprise from being at Pearl Harbor. It showed up 12 hours late.
Lucky again.
Yeah, if it wasn't for this storm, it would have been at Pearl Harbor and a prime target for the
Sure,
Japanese attack.
It would have been, yeah.
So they get into Pearl Harbor. They see the damage. Admiral Bull Halsey was stationed on the Enterprise at that time, and he swears that the only language spoken in hell would be Japanese. What usually takes about 24 hours to rearm, refit, and replenish the Enterprise took 7 hours. They got back out to sea, and the war was on.
You mentioned Bull Halsey. Did your two vets have any stories about Halsey?
Norberg did. I wasn't able to really get a bunch of the stories at the time. I planned to spend more time with him, getting to know more of those stories and the stories of the captains and admirals that he served under. But I brought a really neat.
That's a great poster of
thank
Halsey.
you.
Well, the reason I asked was my dad was on a landing craft in the Pacific, and they had come back from one of the battles, and they assembled some sailors for a speech by Halsey.
Oh, wow.
And my dad said never in his life had he heard such an obscenity-laced address. This guy just peeled the paint off the walls. He was a ferocious man, and hence the name Bull Halsey.
One of the stories that the veterans shared was that under an attack, he would stand out on the captain's bridge, shake his fist, cuss the Japanese bombers.
Doesn't surprise me a bit.
And all he had on was a helmet, you know, and he loved sinking Japanese carriers, which actually got the fleet in some trouble. The Third Fleet in some trouble at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which was towards the end of the war. It was a decoy fleet that I believe the Japanese had up in the northeast.
And he took off after them. Yeah. You know the story, I think I'm right about Halsey. I believe Halsey said that when the war was over, he wanted to ride the Emperor's white horse down the street in Tokyo. Wow. I don't know if he did that or not. But my dad said it was, it was one of these fiery speeches. And whereas Nimitz was a little more, Admiral Nimitz, a little more low-key than Halsey, but he must have been something else.
You know, I'm reading a very good book called Clash of the Carriers. It's by Barrett Tillman, and it's specifically about the Marianas turkey shoot.
Oh, yeah. My dad was there.
Yeah, it's fascinating. But the neat thing that I've found is it gives you very insightful information about the different admirals and officers that served in the Navy at that time, and it talks about how Halsey was kind of a showboat in a sense, that he was sort of kind of flamboyant.
He's sort of the Patton of the Pacific.
Oh, sure, yeah. And I think you need someone like that.
Yeah.
And but you also need that calm, subdued person.
Well, Nimitz is to Eisenhower, Halsey is to Patton.
Sure, right. And it's just, you know, there was an actor that just passed away recently that played Halsey in a one-man show. He was a Marine veteran of World War II. I'm trying to think of his name. Passed away a couple weeks ago. He's in the Shawshank Redemption. He played the older gentleman that I think worked in the library.
Now we better pass on. I know exactly. James Whitmore.
Yeah, Whitmore. He played Halsey in that.
And of course, I always think of Patton as George C. Scott. George C. Scott became Patton. That was really amazing.
Yeah,
but
amazing.
James Whitmore, I could see him playing Halsey. Yeah,
and that's something, Barry, that if you have any advice on, or anyone else, is something that I really want to look at doing, is over the course of a couple years, is doing more reading and research about the Enterprises. The reason why I'm wearing the uniform is that I've created a character, and his name's Lieutenant James Gold. And he was in the Fighting 10, which is Air Group 10, otherwise known as the Grim Reapers. And they flew F-4F Wildcats. And promoting the event, I would go to the Rotary or the Lions Club and speak as Lieutenant James Gold and talk all about the Enterprise. Well, what I really would like to do is go to schools and make it my main goal is to educate, whether it be elementary schools, middle schools, high schools, about World War II, the Navy, and the Enterprise.
Some local vets have done that. Two in particular a few years ago. Ed Hank, who has deceased, he died. He was a 1st Infantry Division officer, Army man, and Bill Hack, who Bill was retired from Iron Workers Local 782. He was a bomber crewman who was shot down, a B-17 gunner. And I think the kids are very receptive to that.
I think so too.
These programs, for example, what reminded me, the Kentucky Humanities Council has a program called the Kentucky Chautauqua Series, in which individuals portray real historical figures.
Right.
And, you know,
That might
my
be-
advice to you would be to find some Kentuckian, and you could become that character with research, and they're very effective programs. We've had some on campus. Daniel Boone came here, and Simon Kenton, and Henry Clay, and Alvin Barkley all came to
seen 'em.
Paducah.
You know, Lincoln's coming to speak at Rotary next week,
So
and it's the same series.
So it's a tremendous program, and you could, I would bet money out of those thousands of sailors, there were Kentuckians on that ship.
You know, there was one of the veterans was good friends with a Bowling Green veteran, and he gave me his number. He had his number. He said call him, and I wasn't able to reach him. But a couple weeks ago, I did receive a phone call from a woman that lives in Dover, Tennessee, and she asked about the event, and I said it's going to be great. And she said, well, my father served on the Enterprise. He's 87. We're going to bring him. So they brought him, and brought 10 of them up, and so I think that might be a good fit.
Unfortunately, so many are gone. I read statistics that 25% of World War II veterans are still living.
Yeah.
They're amazing stories. I try to encourage my students, if they're, got to remember, I guess grandparents, great-grandparents are still alive, because I tell my students, I said, I thought everybody's dad fought in World War II.
I know.
They look at me like, you're kidding, right? It's like, I mean, it's like, in my generation, it was the World War I vets who I remember, and they're, of course, all gone now. But they're these tremendous stories that can be told. And I think you're right. I think these war movies, some of the more recent ones, Saving Private Ryan,
Pearl Harbor,
have gotten some interest in it. But you know, you're right. I was thinking as we were talking, there were some Pacific War movies way back. Sands of Iwo Jima with John Wayne, Midway, In Harm's Way was another one. But I'd like to see somebody do one, and of course, Letters from Iwo Jima was tremendous, and then what was the sequel to it from the Japanese perspective?
Yeah,
Flags from Our Fathers,
and
then Letters from Iwo Jima, that brought that into perspective. But and another thing too, I think just the physical size of an aircraft carrier. I wasn't in service, but I've seen carriers. It's like, how does that thing stay afloat? It's made out of steel.
Yeah. Pennsylvania still.
It's enormous. And well, now again, going back to this History Channel program, in the end, the Enterprise was scrapped.
Sure, 1959.
Chopped into pieces. Where did they do this?
I'm not entirely sure where they scrapped it. I think somewhere.
It was on the East Coast.
Yeah, near the Potomac, or maybe near the Hudson, somewhere.
If memory serves, and it might have been near the Hudson River, because on the History Channel program, they were interviewing a guy who had been on the Enterprise, and he was a steel worker. And he said, you know, I remembered going to and from my work, I would pass the breaking yard where this thing was cut up. And wasn't there a proposal to make it a floating museum?
There was. Halsey led the led the campaign to raise money. The officers, sailors, seamen, many of these people that served on the Enterprise rose over $1 million, and just it wasn't important enough to Congress to do that. Now there were some people that really didn't want it to be they thought it would be better served at. They didn't want kids climbing on it and all
In
this other
fact,
stuff.
that's what I was going to say. One of the veterans that they interviewed for this program said, I don't want this to be turned into a sideshow ship. He said kids running all over it, eating ice cream, and not appreciating it. And I can see that perspective, but on the other hand, but you know, it's interesting. You look back at the end of the Second World War, all these famous airplanes that were scrapped. My parents bought a set of Revereware aluminum cookware when they got married in 1947. Those are planes that were melted down to turn into pots and pans. And there's a tremendous World War II film called The Best Years of Our Lives. If you haven't seen it, what a movie. And in the end, there's a scene where they show these old B-17s in this scrapping yard, and these planes have got bombs painted on. These are famous planes, and so many are gone. And you talk about those naval fighters. There aren't many of those left around.
No.
Wildcats and Hellcats and Corsairs and all these planes.
You know, the author of Clash of the Carriers, Barrett Tillman, has a Devastator, and it was a torpedo. I think it was a torpedo bomber.
TBD.
And he has one. He owns it.
Does it fly?
I think it does. Yeah.
That's amazing, because that's a very rare plane.
You know, when you mention that, another interesting thing about this book is that it really talks about World War II as a country and as a society. There's just something so unbelievable when I read about it, and it's not just the numbers and the type of weapons and the battles. It's just how the country sacrificed, the war bonds, the food rations, the grease, the stills, and it makes me wonder. We won that war, our American people, building our textiles, our clothes, our weapons, our bullets, our ammunition. And if we were to be in that situation now, we would buy that stuff probably from other countries. Probably. We'd have to. I mean.
Yeah, well, that's true. You're right. Our industrial base has definitely slipped. It has. But, you know, World War II was really the only war that America's fought where public opinion was totally unified. I tell my students that you realize the American Revolution, a lot of Americans fought for the British. War of 1812, the New Englanders opposed that. Mexican-American War opposed in the North. Civil War, that's obvious. World War I, there was opposition to that. Vietnam, tremendous opposition to that. But World War II was this total war, and everyone, I can remember, I went to Mayfield High School way back when, and in the auditorium, there were still blackout curtains on the windows.
Well, in the paper today, there was just an article about, I didn't read it, but a World War II structure that was taken to the ground. Did you?
Oh, I didn't.
They look like some kind of towers or something.
Even out near where the atomic plant is, the old Kentucky Ordnance Works was there. There was an ammunition plant at Viola that made 20-millimeter shells for the Navy. Merritt Clothing Company, where my grandmother worked, they made military uniforms. It was a total effort. A lot of rail fences, a lot of iron railing fences disappeared. They were melted down for ordnance. It was a total war. And I think that's what's, you know, of course, Tom Brokaw, The Greatest Generation. And so I've been given a signal that we're out of time, so I've got to hush now, but I enjoyed having you for the program. Maybe we can come back again and talk about this. And I'd like to see you become a character in the Chautauqua series.
I would love that.
That'd be wonderful.
That would be great. I'll keep you updated.
That's good. So I'm Barry Craig. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.